Morning.
Glad that you're all here this morning, and we're going to continue in our brief little series on the on evangelism. And coming to the point here in our evangelism study that it's important that when you're talking with someone, that we've talked about that you need to be an active listener. In other words, you're listening to them tell their story and listening to them not so that you can make a response, but that you're actually genuinely, actively listening to them. There also comes a point in time when you're trying to point someone to Jesus that it's important that you tell them your story. And you actually have, if you're like anyone else, you have multiple stories, depending on where you are in your season of life. You know, and over the last few weeks, we've talked about the attitude of evangelism. We've talked about how Jesus, when he was talking to his disciples, and when he was talking to anyone that would listen to him, that you must count the costs of following him. You've got to know what you're getting into. We have talked about how we must have devotion. We must be devoted 100% to Jesus Christ. We must be devoted to the Word, being students of the Word. We also must be devoted in applying that in our activities, in our daily walks, and people we come into contact with. We also must be devoted to one another. So with that, we must be devoted and have devotion. Another thing that we also talked about in our attitude of evangelism is we must be hospitable people. We must be people that show hospitality, but we also need to receive hospitality when it comes our way. And we talked about that there are three phases in hospitality. There's a welcoming, there's a staying, and then there's a sending. And that's found no matter if it's just a brief conversation, a 10-minute conversation with a total stranger, there's still going to be those three elements in there. And if it's a relationship that lasts years and years and years and years, there's still always those three elements. And we also talked about how we must be active in our ministry. We can't just come to worship and Bible class and Wednesday night class and be students of the Word and then go home and that's all we do. We must be active in our ministry. That's a command that Jesus gave us. He told us before he ascended into heaven to go into all the world and preach the gospel. He didn't say if you felt like it, if you felt good that day, if you want to or not. That's not what he said. He said to go into all the world. That is an indication that we have to be active. We have to be moving. And today we're going to talk about the importance of our story, your story. And it's not just your story, it's the story that Christ and what Christ has done in you and through you. And how he has seen you through difficult, hard times. And how he has also rejoiced with you in those moments of triumph and victory. So we're going to look at the story of Paul in Acts chapter 22, verses 1 through 16. And it's something that we need to understand is Paul has just been previously arrested and he's been beaten. And he's about to go through this again. And he says, let me give a defense. Let me tell you why I'm doing what I'm doing. So let's look at the word. Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, I am a Jew born of Tarsus of Cilicia, and brought up in that city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers as I journeyed toward Damascus, to take those who were also there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus, about noon a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Rise, and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me and came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me, and standing by me said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. And he said, The God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now why do you wait? Rise and be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on his name. Now this is Paul's testimony that he's given about what happened to him. The first thing we need to see is Paul is in chains. He has been arrested and he has been beaten. He is chained up and he is being treated like a criminal. Now here's something that we've talked about this first lesson that we talked about knowing and understanding the cost of being a follower of Christ. If you're going to be a follower of Christ, you've got to know that there are going to be things that's going to cost you. And this is what Paul is saying here. As a follower of Christ, I have been bound in chains. I have been in prison. And I have been beaten. Paul suffered for Christ. And he was beaten for Christ. And if you do your research in the text, not just here, but throughout all of Paul's journey, you will see Paul was beaten 130 times on his back, 65 times on his front, for a total of 195 times. That's why he says, I bear the marks for Christ. He has been literally, physically scarred for following Christ. On top of that, he's been in prison multiple times, shipwrecked, and snake bit. Now, one might say, Paul, are you sure this following Christ thing is worth it? Look what it's costing you. Look what's happening to you. But here's why Paul was convinced. Because he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. Did you catch that? It was all worth it because he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. You see, Paul, before Christ, one of the things that he needed to do to catch their attention was he spoke to them in their native language. He's showing them hospitality. Speaking to them in a tongue that he knows they will listen to and understand. And then he tells them his history. Where he was born is an importance. It's a status symbol. His education. He studied under the best of the best. And how he was zealous for God. So much so that he was persecuting this new thing called the Way. Because he thought that was heresy. They're denouncing the Jewish rituals and their festivals and the temple and the sacrifices and all that entails into Judaism. And they must be brought to justice. See, there's no doubt Paul loved God. He loved him with all his heart. He was just doing some things that weren't right. And so he meets Jesus on the road to Damascus. He's traveling to Damascus because he knows there are some people who follow this Jesus and follow this thing called the Way. And he's going there to arrest them, to bind them up in chains and to drag them back to Jerusalem where they will face judgment. And on the road, Jesus confronts Paul. And Jesus asks Paul a question. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Paul, at this time Saul, is persecuting Jesus because he's persecuting Jesus' people. If you hurt people, you're hurting Christ. Christ is confronting Paul. Incidentally, if you look at it through the lens of hospitality, even Christ here in his confrontation with Saul is opening up hospitality. But Christ is dealing with the hard stuff. And he asks Paul that question. And it perplexes Paul. And he says, "Who are you, Lord?" And the Lord said, "I am Jesus of Nazareth." And he reiterates, "Whom you are persecuting." I don't know what Paul felt at that moment. I don't know if there was any other discussion between him and Christ at this moment. The text doesn't say. But I know because Paul loved God, when he was confronted by Christ on the road, Christ identifies himself to Paul. There's no doubt. Paul goes, "Uh-oh. You are real. Everything that I've heard about you and what's happened is real." But Jesus tells him to do something. He tells him to go on to Damascus. But not to do what he intended to do, but to go meet Ananias. So Paul meets Ananias. And one thing we find out about Ananias is he is a devout man. He is a follower of Christ. Totally 100% devoted. Do you remember we talked about being devoted? So we have the cost of following Christ. Devotion. We see it all in this text. Everything that we've talked about over the last few weeks is all right here. He is a respected man, not only in the Christian community. It says there in the text that he's respected by all the Jews. So this is a very powerful man. And I wonder, we know in the story, if you look back at the previous chapters in Acts, I wonder what Ananias is thinking. You want me to go talk to who? You want me to go talk to Saul? God, you know what he's doing? You know who he is, right? You mean to tell me that Christ is going to ask us to do some hard things? You mean to tell me that Christ is going to ask us to do some things that we're uncomfortable with? That we're not so, wait a minute, hold on. I don't know if I want to do that. I think sometimes when Christ asks us to do something, he's not really kind of asking. He's saying go do it. But we still have the choice of whether we're going to do it or not. And thank God Ananias decided to get over the fear and talk to Paul. Undoubtedly something was talked about here because Ananias teaches Paul the gospel. Now, like I said, we don't know if there was any more conversation between Christ and Paul on the road because it doesn't say. But undoubtedly, Ananias tells Paul about Jesus and what it means and how to become a follower. And Paul has to be led to Damascus by the guys who are following him because he's blinded by this light. And Ananias puts his hands on him and says, "Brother Saul, receive your sight." And he receives his sight. And so then Ananias asks him this question. If you look back at the text, it says, "Now, what are you waiting for? Rise and be baptized. Wash away your sins, calling on His name." We have so many people that want to call on the name of the Lord, and that's where it stops. But if you look at the text, it all happens at the same time. As far as entering into a covenant relationship of salvation with Jesus Christ.
Yes.
He met Jesus on the road. But at that moment, he's still not a Christian.
Yes.
It's only when he is taught the gospel and about who Jesus is, what He did on the cross, the death, the burial, the resurrection. He says, "Now arise and be baptized, washing away your sins." So when is your sins washed away through Scripture?
Amen.
At baptism.
Amen.
How do you call on the name of the Lord for salvation? When you cry out to the name of the Lord for salvation, when does that happen? At baptism. Do we still, after baptism, call on the name of the Lord? Absolutely. But at that moment when you realize you're lost and you need Christ in your life and you call on His name for salvation, it happens at baptism. Now, could Christ have said, "You're one of mine now on the road to Damascus"? Some will say yes. He could have done that. But I would say Christ stuck with the formula that was presented. This is how you become a follower of me. And incidentally, here's the thing. He didn't take away Paul's zealousness. He didn't take away the wiring that Paul had about being on fire for God. But what he did do was put him on the right path by being his follower. And Christ could have been so angry at Paul because of what he was doing to the church. And he probably was. But when you look at the relationship between Christ and Paul on the road, I don't see a whole lot of ignorant judgment, condemnation. I see a question, and then you see a response from Paul. And Paul becomes a follower. Because Christ saw something in Paul that would be so paramount for the cause of the kingdom. And we know we have so much rich literature from Paul. And we have that because he decided to follow Christ. But you see, the thing about this story is not about Saul who becomes Paul. This story is about Christ who saved Paul. And this is also a story about what Christ did in Paul's life and in Paul's ministry. The same Christ that saved Paul has saved you, is saving you, and will continue to save you. This same Christ that saved Paul has the same power to save anyone out there who calls upon the name of the Lord to be saved. It hasn't diminished. It hasn't waned. It hasn't softened. It's the same power today as it was then. He can save, that is, Christ can save anyone who will surrender to Him. If Christ can save the one who persecuted the church and killed Christians, He can save anyone. How many of y'all have ever heard, well, if I walk in those doors, the building's going to fall down on itself because of everything I've done? How many of y'all ever heard that statement from somebody? Do not let somebody make a statement like that without talking to them gently and lovingly, saying, the power of the blood of Christ at the cross of Calvary can save you, no matter what you've done. Don't we sing that song that has the phrase in it, the vilest offenders who will truly obey? You see, it doesn't matter what you've done. No matter how bad it is, sick it is, distorted and twisted it is, if you are convicted of Christ and by Christ, He has the power to save you and wash away your sins. This sacrifice didn't come cheap. It came with a high price and a cost. And we need to understand it. But here's something else that's interesting about this. We need to also be like Ananias. We must be willing to share the gospel, even with people who scare us and make us nervous, make us uncomfortable. Be willing to share it with even dangerous people. We must step out in faith and push back the fear. That's what we must do. And it's hard. And it's scary sometimes. Especially our younger people with what they have to face in school a lot of times. But He tells us over and over and over again in His Word, do not lose heart. Stand firm. Because here's something that's interesting. When you lead someone to Christ, and they become a follower of Christ, and they become in union with Christ, it is now Christ in them, and it's Christ writing their story. You and Christ together today, right now, are writing a story. Did you know that? Did you know that? Because look what Christ did with Paul. He took a vile offender and made him beautiful. Not only that, if we didn't have the writings and the things that Paul did and gone through, we would be amiss by that. But because he did, we have letters 2,000 years old from a man who decided to put on Christ in baptism. One of the things we must be reminded of when we're telling our story is look at what Christ has done in you. How He has seen you through some difficult times, because that's an important story to tell when we're talking with people. It's not something that we tell right off the bat, so to speak, in our relationship. But it's evidences of how Christ has sustained us. And they need to hear those stories. But it's not about anything we've done. It's about what Christ has done in us and then through us. Here's also something interesting, because we also talked about in hospitality. Ananias shows Paul hospitality. He takes in a man at that time who's a very dangerous man. And he shows him hospitality. He welcomes him in, even though he's afraid. And he shares with him the gospel. So even here, we see the welcoming, the staying, and then the sending out. And here's something that's interesting about the gospel of Christ and a follower of Christ. You know, there's hospitality that Christ gives to us, but it's a little bit different. You see, in hospitality to Christ, there's a welcoming in that is learning and becoming and knowing who Christ is. There is, we put on Christ in baptism, there's that staying part. And then when we put on Christ in baptism, become a follower, sometimes He sends us to places in the world for His purpose. So there's that sending. But here's where it gets a little different. With Christ in hospitality, there's a welcoming, there's a staying, and there's a sending you out into the mission field, but then there's a welcoming again that's eternal. And that's the one we long for. That's the one where our focus needs to be. Our focus needs to be on eternal, and our focus needs to be on heaven. When we put our lives into that perspective, it's amazing how things change in our lives. Suddenly, the things that seem so hard or frustrating don't seem as much frustrating anymore because it's just a fleeting moment in time. When you put it in the perspective of time. So here's something else. Be of encouragement to others to write their story with Christ. Because Christ is still writing a story with you. And He's writing it with me. And He's also now writing it collectively with each other today. And He's doing that all over the world. Which is fascinating and mind-blowing. But that's what He's doing. To put on Christ in baptism. To be a follower of Him. Knowing the costs. Being devoted. Being active. Showing hospitality. And also telling your story. Those are the things we do. Whatever your need is this morning. And however way that we can help you. Whether if it is putting on Christ in baptism. Or if you're struggling with anything that has got you down, hurt, depressed, angry, frustrated, we want you to know that you have brothers and sisters here that will help bear that burden with you and walk with you. To love you, to encourage you, to spur you on. Whatever your need is this morning, and have a way that we can help. And we ask that you come now as we stand and as we sing.